I'm grateful to the organizers of the conference for asking me to give this keynote address. It's a shame that we can't all be in Tokyo, as was the plan last year. I'm very fond of the city and was looking forward to my visit. The first time I ever visited Tokyo was to check in on Mary Brinton's dissertation research, and it's a notable coincidence that she's giving the other conference keynote the following day. So, in this talk, I want to tell you about my new book, which is The Genesis of Rebellion, written with Steve Pfaff at the University of Washington. This is a book about high-risk collective action. It's long been appreciated that collective action in large groups is problematic due to the possibility that there are free riders in the group. And these free riders seek to benefit from the success of the collective action without contributing to its costs. And now, however difficult collective action is in large groups, it's even worse when we talk about the possibility of high-risk collective action, because then the costs of participation are extremely high. And that's certainly the case with respect to the subject of this book, which is mutiny. In mutiny, the cost of conviction is death by hanging. And due to this costliness, it's no surprise that mutiny only occurs rarely. In fact, in the 80 years from 1740 to 1820 that covers the study period, there were only 62 completed mutinies. And by a completed mutiny, I refer to situations in which the crew took over total control of the vessel. Now, given the prevalence of rebellion in the modern world, you might wonder, why on earth did we choose to study the mutiny in the 18th and 19th centuries? And there are three answers: evidence, evidence, and evidence. Many years ago, when I was at High Table in New College at Oxford, I happened to be sitting next to a young man who was complaining about his day at the Public Records Office. I asked him what he'd been doing there, and he replied that he was using the Royal Navy archive. I asked him what kinds of things that archive contained, and he told me that they had information on every sailor who'd been on every single ship since the Navy had been founded in the 16th century, in the 17th century. I immediately realized that this could provide the basis for an innovative study of high-risk collective action, namely of mutiny. And years later, we received the funding necessary to collect the relevant data. There were two fundamental reasons, advantages for this particular research site. Most studies of collective action sample on the dependent variable. They're case studies of existing rebellions or riots or revolutions, either that recently happened or happened in the past or are ongoing. But this makes it difficult to unravel the causes of rebellion. In contrast, studying mutiny offers the prospect of getting past this obstacle of selection bias. This can be done by comparing the very small number of ships that experienced mutiny with the much larger number that did not. And to accomplish this, we relied on a method that's commonly used in epidemiology, known as case control. Now, beyond this, the Royal Navy records are unique in their detail. We engaged in truly heroic data collection in the UK National Archives in Kew, based on handwritten documents, sometimes quite hard to decipher, as you might imagine, and daily reports of events and weekly censuses of the seamen. We also collected narrative evidence of the mutinies and their participants from courts-martials and Admiralty reports. This wealth of evidence permitted us to explain not only why some ships engaged in mutiny, whereas others did not, but also just which individuals initiated and participated in rebellion, even though the penalty for so doing was death by hanging. Now, Royal Navy ships, the largest of which contained upwards of 850 sailors, were microcosms of British society, replete with a complete and explicit hierarchy of rank positions that, in some respects, mirrored the British stratification system. At the top of the hierarchy, in the so-called, if you want to think about it, the ruling class, were the officers and midshipmen, followed by the warrant officers, and below them, akin to a middle class, were the petty officers and the able-bodied seamen. Then the ship's so-called proletariat consisted of ordinary seamen, landsmen, marines, and servants. And finally, at the bottom of the hierarchy were recently impressed sailors. Now, in times of war, the British state allowed the Navy to round up eligible males on land and dragoon them onto ships without their consent, and that's what impressment consisted of. Now, the ship was a community of fate where everyone had a designated role and well-defined set of obligations. Now, the first question that this evidence could enable us to answer is, who were the insurgents? Who were the people who were willing to risk the excessive punishment of conviction for mutiny? Now, since it's long been thought that economic inequality is a driver of rebellion, it was reasonable to expect that the sailors at the bottom of the stratification system, the impressed and the lowest rank sailors, would be the ones most likely to initiate rebellion. This turned out not to be the case. As you can see, the petty officers and the top men, who were the Royal Navy's labor aristocrats, played the leading roles. Now, in retrospect, this finding is really not such a surprise because it supports much of the literature on rebellion and revolution. Now, the second question, what were the causes of mutiny among ships, provided one of the big surprises of the study. Now, a main controversy in the literature on collective action concerns the causal role of grievances. In some of the early work in the 1950s, collective action was considered to be the result of participants' irrational reactions to the breakdown of social norms. Then in the 1960s, it was seen as, in contrast, as a rational response to objective grievances. And later, however, not much later, but later, grievances were discounted as causes because they were regarded as constants that couldn't explain variations in collective action. That's to say, people were aggrieved much of the time, and therefore it was like a constant, and yet instances of large-scale collective action were quite relatively rare. Since about 2010, however, there's been a renewal of attention to collective grievances, especially notable in the Civil War literature on horizontal inequalities. We found plenty of evidence in the record that Navy sailors expressed grievances in the petitions that they made to the authorities. So I'll read this. It's just one of many that we obviously found. My lord, we the ship's company of the Impetueux would wish to make known to your lordship the usage we've received since Sir Edward Pellew commanded us is such we've never been used to this war by any other captain we've sailed under. It is unacceptable. Sir Edward has punished different people in the ship to the amount of 49 dozen and upwards for very frivolous crimes since we left Cawsand Bay, and it's well known that we never deserved the barbarous usage we now experience at the hands of Sir Edward. And his humanity to the sick is little better than to the well. Relying upon your lordship's goodness and wisdom, we hope you redress our grievances with another captain and second lieutenant and a fourth lieutenant. Since merely writing these petitions could also place the instigators at severe risk, they devised an ingenious method of concealing the identity of the instigators. The petitions were written in the form of round-robin letters that made it impossible for the authorities to identify who had initiated the petition. So grievances were definitely in play in our story, but in contrast to most of the previous literature, we distinguish between two different kinds of grievances that were often ignored. The most common type of grievances are structural, due to incumbency in subordinate positions in a social structure. What's often neglected in studies of rebellion, however, are incidental grievances due to unforeseen events that cause loss to the members of specific groups. We found empirical indicators for each type of grievance in our data. So here you can see that wages, the percent of sailors who were impressed, per capita flogging, for instance, were structural grievances, and we found the percent sick, the reduction in rations, and accidents at sea as an incidental, examples of incidental grievances. At this point, we expected that mutiny would most likely break out when sailors' structural grievances, those negatively affecting their material circumstances, came to the fore. This would mean that ships having a high proportion of impressed sailors, excessive punishment, unpaid wages, and the like would be the ones most likely to erupt in rebellion. After all, serving in the Royal Navy in this era was anything but a walk in the park. Here, for example, is Samuel Johnson's dyspeptic description of naval life. No man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into jail. For being in a ship is being in a jail with the chance of being drowned. And a ship is worse than a jail. There is in a jail better air, better company, better conveniency of every kind, and a ship has the additional disadvantage of being in danger. Yet many individuals in disadvantaged statuses expect their lot to be a tough one, and they don't necessarily resort to rebellion on this account. Individuals who find themselves perpetually subject to structural grievances often feel fatalistic about their situation, and this can militate against the prospect of engaging in collective action. For example, to take a case close to home, how many of your graduate students rebel when the department compels them to take comprehensive exams? To our surprise, the single greatest determinant of mutiny was not a structural grievance, but an incidental one. Incidental grievances arise from unanticipated situations like navigational errors, accidental grounding, hurricanes, infections, and the like that decrease the welfare of the crew, but whose ill effects can be attributed, fairly or unfairly, to the negligence of the captain. These kinds of grievances don't lead to fatalism, as the structural ones often do, but to anger. And anger is much more likely to motivate collective action than resignation or fatalism. Now, of all the grievances motivating rebellion on board the ship, it turns out that by far the most important cause of mutiny was sickness. This was a surprise. If more than 10% of the crew was infected, the odds of mutiny increased substantially. We discovered that the sailors believed that the captain and the officer class was obligated to provide for the security and welfare of the ship. This included the obligation to keep the men healthy, To the degree that sickness pervaded the vessel, this was regarded by the sailors as evidence of what they termed ill usage, and what's referred to as usage in the petition in a previous slide. What we today would consider poor governance. As a result, the captain was delegitimated in the eyes of the crew, and ringleaders could emerge to argue for redress, and sometimes for mutiny. Now, how generalizable are our findings to more contemporary instances of rebellion? Many insurgencies are carried out by groups that have the capacity to select their members in order to maximize the commonality of their goals and their ideology, and that they and also maximize their trustworthiness. The crews of the Royal Navy ships, however, were not selected by potential insurgents, but by the Admiralty. This means that the vessels contain many individuals with different ideologies and dispositions to hold their leaders accountable for their decisions. This situation is similar to that faced by workers in firms, students in schools, and people in prisons. This difference should have made the problem of collective action even more difficult to overcome, since the group, the relevant group, in this case the ship's crew, could contain also oppositional members who were loyal to the regime and to the officer class. Given that mutiny was even more unlikely under these circumstances, the study therefore represents an a fortiori example of collective action. Now, since we found the role of sickness was so critical in explaining mutiny, we naturally considered the history of COVID-19 in the United States to ask a similar question. If the Royal Navy story were generalizable, then President Trump's inadequate response to the virus would have delegitimated him in the eyes of voters, as happened on our Royal Navy ships, and he would have been swept out of office in a landslide in the 2020 election. In fact, however, he nearly won that election. Now, one key difference between our story and his has to do with attribution. Since the U.S. political system is federal, this means that governance is divided, and responsibility is divided, and blame is divided. Trump shifted the blame of the response to COVID-19 to governors and public health experts. This was a marked contrast with the situation on our ships. Authority on a ship is unified in its captain. Blame attribution is straightforward. Royal Navy commanders were the kings of the ship, and thus they bore the ultimate blame for bad governance, even when the damaging incidents weren't fully under their control, and others, like the Admiralty, might have been at fault. Although, in fact, Trump's lamentable governance probably was ultimately responsible for his loss, that the election was so close points to something else that might have been missing from our story, namely misinformation. Trump's lies, abetted by Republican legislators, Fox News, and social media, fostered misinformation about the pandemic. The constantly repeated claim was that the virus was no more serious than the flu, that it would soon disappear. In this story, the Democrats and their fake news outlets in the lamestream media were stoking unjustified fear about COVID-19 to damage Trump's re-election prospects. These messages muted the reaction to the handling of virus among those in Trump's base and enabled a large section of the electorate to hold him blameless for the cratering of the economy and the pervasiveness of the virus. Did the role of information also affect the prospect of rebellion in our study? It turns out that the control of information indeed was vital for the maintenance of solidarity among the rebellious ships in the mass mutiny in the Nore in 1797. The Nore mutiny, which occurred at the eastern end of the Thames estuary, was the largest mutiny in the history of the Royal Navy. More than 40 ships engaged in the mutiny, and this occurred in the midst of the Napoleonic War against France. Forever fearful that the French might invade the British Isles from mightily discontented Ireland, the Crown did everything that it could to defuse the mutiny. It offered sailors amnesty in the form of a royal pardon if they could induce their ships to abandon the mutiny and return to the nearby port of Sheerness. To that end, it sent boats to each of the mutinous ships to proclaim the royal pardon, that is to say, the amnesty. And by and large, over the course of the entire mutiny, the tactic worked, and ultimately the mutiny fell apart. The first ship, you notice that only 4 ships left the mutiny in the first period, and a larger number in the second period from 7 to 15 June. The first ship to abandon the mutiny was the HMS Clyde, as pictured in this contemporary painting. You notice that it was being fired on by the other mutinous ships as a means of dissuading it from leaving the mutiny and going to the port of Sheerness. However, the mutineers on some of the ships refused to allow the Admiralty's representatives on board, and thus on those ships the offer of amnesty was not presented to the sailors. Now, we analyzed the effect of the amnesty on the Nore mutiny and found that those ships that permitted a reading of the royal pardon were among the first to abandon the mutiny. You see that the pardon read on ships was a key variable in explaining the timing of the defection from the Nore mutiny. Thus, in the Nore mutiny, the control of information indeed was a key element in maintaining the solidarity of the collective action. And the analogy with the role of information on reactions to the pandemic in the US, both with respect to masking and the willingness to be vaccinated, is too obvious to detail here. So to conclude, the moral of the story is that although they're relatively easy to quantify, economic and material disadvantages do not necessarily foster rebellion. People who are subject to these disadvantages are sure to have structural grievances, but these often promote fatalistic attitudes that discourage participation in collective action. By contrast, incidental grievances tend to inspire anger that favors collective action. It turns out that incidental grievances often have to supply the spark that triggers rebellion, as Lenin may have known when he titled his famous pre-revolutionary newspaper Iskra, which means the spark in Russian. Thank you very much for your attention.